Welcome everyone to today's Seedbox event, and I'm especially happy and honored to welcome today our guest and speaker, who is Hester Blum, who holds a researcher residency here at the Seedbox this month of May. And Hester is associate professor at Penn State University, and her research extends over quite wide areas, I should say, which can be mapped out with concepts such as environmental humanities, literature, American literature especially, I think, oceanic studies and book history, but which explores topics and spaces that cannot be such easily demarcated, I would say as well. Hester is the author of several books, such as the much acclaimed and prized study, The View from the Masthead, Maritime Imagination and Antebellum American Sea Narratives from 2008. That's a long title. And she has also edited several collections of essays, such as Horrors of Slavery from 2008 and Turns of Event, American Literary Studies in Motion from 2016. Her recent research has very much been oriented not only toward the sea and the maritime, but also toward the northern parts of the planet, as manifested in her new book, just out from Duke University Press, The News at the Ends of the Earth, the Ecomedia of Polar Exploration, which looks highly interesting. I haven't been able to read it, it's just out, but I look forward to take part of it. Hester calls this approach an investigation into polar ecomedia, which is a very thought-provoking and suggestive designation, I think. And this is also the orientation and optics in her current project that she will work with while here in Linköping and at the Seedbox, which we'll also hear more about today, I think. And the title of today's talk is, as you can see on the slide there, Ice Age's Indigenous Polar Temporality, and we look very much forward to hear more about that. So please, Hester, once again, welcome here. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jesper, for that generous introduction, and thank you for being here today. I'm really glad to speak with you about the work that I've been doing on the polar regions that is extending into the new project I'm doing for the Seedbox here. What I'm going to do today is talk a bit about the book that has just been published, since it does form the basis of what I'm looking to do with this new project, which is on ice and temporality. So I'll talk a little bit about the project I just completed and give you some examples from it, and then talk a bit about what this new project on ice and temporality that I've been working on here in Linköping, how that extends from that project, and also give you some brief examples of what I'm thinking about with that project. So the book, as Jesper has mentioned, that has just come out, is called The News at the Ends of the Earth, or The Print Culture of Polar Exploration. And it's about the ephemeral forms of information that circulate in geophysical and climate extremity, both today in our current moment of climate change and resource extraction, as well as in polar expeditionary history throughout the 19th century, from the early 19th century to the early 20th century. And so in this book, I am bringing to light a body of printed ephemera, works that were not designed to last, works that were disposable for the sake of entertainment, for the sake of temporary pleasure, and not designed as monumental print works that were created by polar expedition members while they were in ice-bound ships in the polar winter, immobilized and in total darkness. And they did these largely on printing presses, which they brought with them to the polar regions, which, for whatever reason, for all of the popular interest in polar expeditionary history, nobody really talks about this, which was one of the original questions I had when starting the project, is why were they doing this, and why has this not been part of polar history? Why it's very weird to have a printing press at the North Pole or at the South Pole. Why? What was the point? Why were they doing this? And so I'm calling this material polar ecomedia, and I can say more about that in a minute. And polar ecomedia in the project I've just finished includes ship newspapers in particular. That's what I've been particularly interested in. polar sailors created and printed these parodic, humorous newspapers that seem to have all the appearance and the sections of a regular newspaper, but are doing so in comic ways. They're not reporting actual news, except to the extent that they are making fun of each other. They're reporting, there are real estate notices, there are advertisements, there are stories about the sled dogs having relations with one another. And they are, as it's been suggested to me when I've talked about this work, they're essentially the social media of these expeditions. And they did not circulate outside of the ships. In very few exceptions, they were recirculated among some patrons and some friends and family members, but they were not designed for public consumption, which is one of the reasons why they're very little known. And in addition to these newspapers, I've been also interested in this project in notes in bottles, messages in cairns, or in stone piles, information circuits, rescue notices for missing expeditions, playbills for shipboard theatricals. And so I wanted to just show you briefly a few examples of what some of these shipboard newspapers looked like. The first printed newspaper was called the Illustrated Arctic News, and this is a facsimile that circulated in London in limited editions after the expedition returned home. And it was partially printed, it had printed headers and was otherwise in manuscript hand, and was published on a ship that was engaged in a search for a missing British explorer named Sir John Franklin. I'm not sure if he's known in Sweden at all. He was a British explorer looking for the Northwest Passage, who launched in 1845 with 2 ships and 130 men, and never returned. And ships looked for him, dozens of expeditions, dozens and dozens, over 40 in the first 15 years alone, went looking for them. And that search continued up until 2014 and 2016, when the 2 ships were found. And when I started working on this project, I never thought that the ships would ever be found. They've been annual searches essentially for 175 years. Yeah, they were on the seafloor. And part of it, the accessibility, is that's exactly right. But also one of the reasons that they were finally found has a little bit to do with my new project too, in the sense that the Inuit in the area, the Indigenous people of northern Canada, had said from the beginning, we saw the men over there, they were starving, they had to abandon their ships, here's where they are. And were always dismissed and always accused of either lying or having something nefarious to do with this expedition. At any rate, the Inuit, precisely where the Inuit had said that the ships were, was where they were found a few years ago. But the first printing presses, the reason I'm mentioning this, the first printing presses were brought to the Arctic as part of the search for Sir John Franklin's ships. And the idea was that rescue notices would be printed on colored paper and could be circulated sometimes by fire balloon, sometimes among Indigenous people. So once the sailors had the presses on ship, they decided to get more creative with it. So here's just another example. This is a manuscript newspaper on a ship that did have a press, and used that press to print a library catalog, for example, in part. Another example, this is my favorite title, is called The Weekly Guy, which is also part of the Franklin searches. Most of these ships were, in one way or the other, either looking for the Northwest Passage, the North Pole, or for the missing Franklin expedition. Another is called The Flight of the Plover, or the North Polar Charivari. Charivari is an obscure term that means a kind of hodgepodge, a random assortment of loud things. So even the titles are funny. There's the Queen's Illuminated Magazine, the Polar Almanac.
Do you know how many copies they were printed in, and how big is the crew here?
These are excellent questions. The crews range, the smallest ships had about 14 men on them, 14 or 15. The largest had 200, but most of them were maybe around 30 to 50. They were relatively small. Some of these newspapers exist only in one copy. They produced enough for the whole ship, so there might be a couple of dozen. But for the most part, there might be 1 or 2 copies, which is one of the reasons it's been little known about, because only one archive has a holding of it. And that one archive can be in one of dozens of places. So in this example right here, the Port Folk Weekly News, which was a manuscript newspaper, and it has the most dramatic cover, this particular issue. There's only one copy of each one of these numbers. So some others, the ones that were printed, tended to have more copies.
Volume 1, number 2, is it?
Yeah, well, they did a couple of numbers, but each one of them, there's only one copy. This is a printer's proof for a paper called The Midnight Sun, which has terrible puns in it, terrible wordplay, and only lasted 1 issue. I don't think that those things are necessarily related, but they might be. The Arctic Eagle was printed by an expedition that was led by a man who used to be a journalist, a newspaper reporter for the Brooklyn Eagle. So the Arctic Eagle is a play on the Brooklyn Eagle. And what it produced, and the illustrations here are all cut by the men on ship. It's amazing. And this is one of the only photographs we have of printing in action. And this is a man who's printing the Arctic Eagle. And I love this photo for many reasons, but the intimacy of this man the printer here, who's surrounded by men in bunks, covered up in blankets and in woolens. You can see in the upper left of the picture the stack of paper. So this is one in which we have multiple copies. And he's just surrounded by these men, and part of it is that the body heat is what's helping to keep the ink running, the ink liquid. This was a problem when you're printing in sub-zero temperatures. You have to have the ink be liquid. So it's a really remarkable photograph. And they would print playbills of shipboard theatricals. And shipboard theatricals were putting on plays was something that sailors have done across many nations for hundreds of years. But making newspapers is not something sailors usually do. Passengers on ships would do newspapers in the 19th century to entertain themselves on long voyages. If they were going to Australia, if they were going across the Pacific, that was common. But sailors almost never do newspapers, and part of the reason they do in this instance is because they're icebound in the darkness for 60 to 100 days of no light and no movement and no work. And so their work becomes these papers. But doing the plays was a big deal, and they would write some of their own plays too. So the last item on this playbill, which is called The Pantomime of Zero, is a farce that was written by the men on the ship that has to do with a villain named Frosticus, who's who's very chilly. And it's the Pantomime of Zero because of 0 degrees. It's all hilarious. So I mentioned that they have the printing presses because of the need to find Franklin. And so the messages that they would print on these machines included these silk balloon messages, they were called. So, a fire balloon that can drift with the wind. These messages would be tied in bundles to the string of the balloon, and the logic was that if somebody came across them, they would know the information on these slips would be the longitude and latitude of the rescuers, and also where supply storage units were. It didn't work. They didn't travel very far, and almost none of them were ever recovered. So, some of the more elaborate productions happened in Antarctica. And there are reasons for this that have to do in part with the relative stability of a continental landmass versus the Arctic. And so the South Polar Times was first published by Ernest Shackleton, who was the most interested Antarctic printer by far, and was the first editor of the South Polar Times. which was later taken over by Apsley Cherry Garrard. And we see him here at his typewriter in a hut in Antarctica. He wrote a book, which is I think the best of the accounts of polar exploration, which is called The Worst Journey in the World, and which is amazing. It's like a truly amazing book. And he's kind of a tragic and fascinating figure, but a brilliant writer. And so he became the editor of that paper as well. They would have contributions would be anonymous, which doesn't make a lot of sense when you're in a group of 20 men for 3 straight years sometimes. That anonymity was largely a fiction, but it also had the presumption of trying to create some kind of distance. Just a few others here too. A newspaper on one of the voyages that Shackleton was making to Antarctica. But the most amazing artifact of this printing is a book called Aurora Australis, which was printed on Shackleton's Nimrod voyage, not his famous endurance one that everyone knows him for. But on his Nimrod voyage, they printed a 120-page book, which was they probably made about 100 copies. 80 plus of them have been identified and located at this point. It was printed at the sign of the Penguins, and the latitude and longitude are given here. And they bound the books in boards made from the boxes in which their supplies had been held. So and the editions are known often by how this functions. So the stewed kidney edition here. There are ones that say fruit, pate, tea. And so this was adapting these kinds of materials to their use. But Shackleton had also, before this expedition, had trained his men for 2 weeks with a London printer to learn how to use the press and how to learn the lithography machine. But they didn't learn how to cross-country ski. And they didn't choose to accept what the Norwegian rivals, such as Roald Amundsen, were doing, which not only skiing, but using furs instead of wool.
But did they print? Did the Norwegians? I don't think they did.
They did not print. They had other priorities. Although Fridtjof Nansen, surviving was their priority, exactly. Fridtjof Nansen had a newspaper on the Fram called the Framsja, but it's a manuscript newspaper. So, and is also, from what I understand, very funny, although I, again, cannot read it myself. But he provided a translation of his account, has some examples from the Framsja. But no presses.
Later, but not much later than what came out.
A little later. No, it was around the same time. It was in his, I think the date on that was the 1890s. I'm not, yes. But no presses. At any rate, and so even in their winter quarters, the printing press and the lithography machine are kind of centrally located, like they're right next to the dining room table. And so here's a picture of the press on which that book was published. Again, this was their priority, was producing this kind of monumental work. And here's a shot of the men reading newspapers. So I could talk about this for the entire time, but I probably should move on to some other things. So what I've been interested in with these materials are how the paradox of printing things that were designed to be disposed of. On the one hand, newspapers we don't save unless it's either a huge event, maybe it's the day of the birth of a child, you save the newspaper for that day, perhaps. They only become souvenirs when something significant has happened. Newspapers are designed to be disposed of. So these are newspapers that are designed to be disposed of. They have the permanence of print, and thinking of how ephemera serves as a way of thinking about human life in a moment of climate extremity and climate change. So the climate extremity that these expedition members were experiencing was one that they were starting to become aware about changing climate, and I'll say more about that in a second. But thinking about how in a place in which human life is very difficult and lacks permanence, when speaking of white Westerners, not Indigenous people, what does the ephemeral nature of this printed material tell us about how human life is registered? And so that's the broader interest that I bring to my work in general that links the environmental interests with my interest in print culture and book history. How do printed works or how do texts circulate information about climate and about human both survival or human record keeping, and what those kinds of relationships are. And so one of the reasons why these sailors were using newspapers in the argument that I'm making in this book is that we think of newspapers as regulating time. They're often daily or weekly. And in the polar regions, and you know this more in Sweden than we do in the US, in polar night or polar summer, there are no days in the way that we associate days as being marked by the rise and the fall of the sun. So for long periods of time, above and below the Arctic and Antarctic circles, there's no day or there's no night. And so what is a newspaper measuring in those circumstances? So it's both a way to regulate time, but also a recognition that that's not how time is functioning. And so that's the
Pastime.
Exactly. Pastime is a big part of it. It's a huge part of it. But these papers are not, they can't even maintain their own regularity. Some of them that are supposed to be weekly will then appear 7 days later, and then 12, and then 20. And there's a real, this attenuation of time that happens. And so that's something that I write about in the book that just came out, but is still very much at the forefront of my interest in this new project. And so the newspapers are being used by these sailors to kind of anchor themselves within a connection back home where newspapers help to, in the famous Benedict Anderson formulation, they help nations to imagine communities. If nations are imagined communities, the newspaper is one of the things that allows that function to happen. That a dispersed people who are not in constant contact imagine themselves as all part of the same nation. But on polar ships, the nation is constituted by everybody sitting around a table, essentially. So how does that relate to your sense of a location in the world? For the classic understanding of newspapers, too, have to do with a kind of national time where that function doesn't work in the polar regions either. So I've been interested in thinking about how we can think about climate extremity and climate change within those kinds of regulatory functions that are both linked to the nation in the sense that a newspaper is a national form often, but also not because they're at the literal ends of the earth. So, and so one of the things I have been interested in doing, I think I'm going to skip ahead in some of my examples I was going to show you some examples of fictional stories that appear in a couple of the Antarctic newspapers that are explicitly about climate change. Fictional stories in which future aliens have come to Earth after the humans are gone and find that the reason that humans have disappeared is because they did not heed the climate warnings of that particular Antarctic expedition. So there's a real sense of, these read very similarly to today's climate fictions about a kind of post-human world. So I was going to show you some examples of those, and we can return to them. But I think what I'll do instead is talk a little bit about the new project that I've been thinking of, since, again, I could talk about these newspapers all day, but I'm going to skip ahead. So let me just hustle through some slides here. Although I will show you this picture, this illustration from an alien who has come across the records of the British Antarctic expedition of 1909, who's found the elixir of life, and so with vacuum tubes, yes. And then there's another story in which a lot of these fictions have imagined that the South Pole in particular is warm and tropical. That once you, and the North Pole too, this is the theory, this 19th century theory of an open polar sea beyond the ice caps, that once you get far enough north or far enough south, you find the tropics. And sometimes that tropical space is an entrance to a hollow earth. which is often in these fictions. And so in this particular case, this is a short story that's in the book Aurora Australis that Shackleton printed. They find this warm tropical region. Everything is gigantic, including these mushrooms, which they're using as umbrellas.
Can I ask?
Yes.
Is that book then written by that one author or a compilation of several contributors?
Most of the men on the expedition contributed. So there's poetry in it, there are fictional stories, there are accounts of climbing one of the volcanic mountains in Antarctica, and so it is an overall, it's a group effort. Mm-hmm. Different men did the printing, did the lithography. It's really remarkable, and it has been scanned online through a couple of different sources. So I can give you a link to it too. It's amazing. Okay, so much as I would like to talk to you about the tardigrades and the moss piglets, I'm going to skip ahead here. All right, so in this new project that I've outlined here for the seed box, and that I, again, will extend from this previous work in ways that I think will be clear and in some ways are slightly baroque, or I haven't quite figured out the contours, which is why I'm glad to be in conversation here. I've been thinking in working through what ice means as a register for time and as a register for human time. And so part of that main interest has, in extending from the newspaper regulation of time, has been thinking about when we talk often about ages within human history. There's the Stone Age or the Bronze Age or the Iron Age. Later you have the Petroleum Age, the Atomic Age. These epochs of human history are keyed to resources that humans are using and exploiting and often extracting from the earth, right? But an ice age that is not what an ice age typically means. An ice age is part of a climate condition over long stretches of time in which global cooling produces extensive movements of ice caps and ice sheets, changes climates, changes human behaviors as a result. And so an ice age is not previously been keyed to a human timescale, right? Humans can experience ice ages, but an ice age does not presume a kind of human element in the way that the petroleum age or the atomic age do. So the project started by trying to think of what an ice age would mean when keyed to a human scale, and how in a moment in which climate change is best illustrated by talking about melting ice caps, even though that is not the only thing that is happening with global climate change. And it's not the only result, but it's the most visible image. If you Google climate change, often you see a picture of like a polar bear on a vanishing ice, right? This has become an index of registering climate change. And so in thinking of how ice becomes a timeline for human extremity potential extinction, but also as a way of thinking of it as resource-driven, because climate change has made it more possible for especially many of the northern powers, the circumarctic nations, to do continued and increased oil and gas extraction in the north. This is obviously a big ongoing question. And the reason that those resources are now available is because of that climate change. The Northwest Passage that had been sought for 500 years is now available because of climate change. This fantasy of this warm, open polar sea of all of these fictions from the 18th and 19th century is now a reality for much of the year, or for part of the year, and will increasingly become so. And the reason that all of this has happened is because of the industrialized need for fossil fuel that began with those searches in early modernity for a Northwest Passage, which was in part about moving resources around the globe that is part of Indigenous genocide in the Americas. And so it's been a cycle that's been produced by the drive to move resources, produce industrialization, which in turn now makes the things available in turn. Yes?
I'm sure you're also aware of the Lewis and Maslin definition of
Yes.
the Anthropocene by way of an ice core that also defined, the entering to colonial times.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly. Yes. And even though the International Geographical Council, whatever their acronym actually is, has determined that the Anthropocene spike is 1945 because of the atomic age, I join with what I imagine you and most scholars that I'm in conversation with that are much more interested in the Orbis theory of the 1610 New World colonialism, in which the extermination of 60 million people had a permanent effect on global climate. And as others have argued so well, it's a lot easier for humans, I think, to think of 1945 because atomic energy it's not a controversial topic in the way that thinking of Western genocide of indigenous peoples is. I'm not sure why, but it's there we have it. But so that cycle has been repeated in the north part as well. So I've been thinking about those questions about what kind of explanatory power ice has in this context, as a way of thinking through resource extraction, as thinking of a register of human activities, as a metaphor for anything from glacial pace, which is supposed to mean something that's very slow, and that's not what a glacial pace means anymore, for one, right? Thinking of something frozen in time. Things that are frozen in time don't anymore. There's a lot of ways in which the metaphor of ice has ceased to have the meaning that it used to have. And so that's been part of the interest that I've had. But I've also been thinking of it in terms, and this is where the seed box in particular is so interesting to me, in forms of institutional collaboration that have to do with climate and environment and the humanities and the sciences. I've been involved in a couple of different projects, both at my home institution and elsewhere, that are designed to bring together polar scientists and climate scientists and humanists. And they've been amazingly productive for me intellectually, and I think for the scientists as well. But the institutions who've sponsored them have not continued to do so, in part because humanities grants are on a very different scale than science grants, for one. And in a time where I don't know if this is the case as much in Sweden as it is in the US, in which academics are increasingly compelled to self-fund our research through constant external grant applications in ways that weren't a requirement before, but are increasingly becoming a requirement all around, which has to do with the withdrawal, especially in the US, of any kind of federal or state financing for education. And so in that kind of context, whereas a grant on a humanities scale means an enormous amount to me, it's minuscule compared to what scientific grants are. And so the intellectual experiment of joining together a polar humanist with an Arctic biologist doesn't make economic sense to the university anymore. And so in the same way that, and I'm hoping that the project will produce an analogy here that is less glib or slick or easy, but with higher education right now, it has been focused too much on short-term solutions to problems that require really long, patient solutions. That's the case in academia. It's been the case in the way the US in particular has dealt with climate change. Again, part of why I want to be in conversation in the seed box and in places like Sweden, and really virtually every other country in the world other than the US, you can see the effects of an attention to climate change at every level of society here in a way that is just not evident in the US, and is not the same kind of urgency. And that's even when we don't have a grotesquely evil president. It still has not been the case. And so trying to think about how these collaborations can produce the work of that long, patient desire not just to chase after the new, and the new is always important, but part of the scale of thinking of ice as part of this temporality is that ice is both something that's solid and not solid. It's on the move all the time. It's really variable. And so thinking through this, not just as a metaphor for how institutional collaboration and movement can work, but thinking through what those possibilities are. And so where I'm beginning with this project, and I should also say too that part of what this project will do is emerge from an Arctic expedition that I'll be joining in 2 months that is going through the Northwest Passage. And it's the 3rd year in a row that this expedition has been scheduled to happen. It's been canceled 2 years in a row for reasons that are super interesting to me for this project too. The first year, and this is an expedition that is a joint product of a university in the US, not my own, a different one, that has funding from our government's National Science Foundation, so the highest level of science funding that one can get, as well as a documentary filmmaker who wants to make a film about climate change and the Arctic. And I'm the only humanist in this project. They are bringing students in the project to do polar science. And they always say do science, which I find to be, because I don't say that I do, I'm going to go do some literature right now. So the scientists all say, we're going to make a science plan and do science, which I find hilarious. And so the first year they had contracted with a tall ship, a masted sailing ship, which broke contract shortly before it was supposed to start. Which then I was later told was a relief because that ship was not apparently very safe. So that was, but that's a very 19th century way for expeditions to fail, is when the ship is not available or has a problem, right? And then last summer, the expedition had begun, and I was on the second leg of it. There are 2 parts to it. And they were in the Arctic, and the ship ran aground. And they were at this point, they were on a Russian icebreaker. And the ship ran aground, sustained massive hull damage, and they had to be rescued, and they were 14 hours sail from the nearest rescue ship. So fortunately nobody was hurt, but it was a reminder that Arctic travel is not safe. There was this Norwegian cruise ship a month or 2 ago that had to evacuate. This is happening all the time. So it's supposed to happen in July, and hoping everything goes well. We're now actually on a Swedish ship, so that actually gives me a lot more. That gives me a lot more confidence. Truly, it gives me a lot more confidence.
How long?
I'll be there for almost 2 weeks, about 12 days. And but as the Arctic humanist, once again, I keep offering, here's what I can do with the students. We're going to make our own newspaper. We're going to study all the various aspects of Arctic literature and history. And the scientists keep saying, no, we don't. Thank you. You'll be fine. I think I'll be
cross-country skiing.
I do. Exactly.
No.
One hopes, right? But anyway, so part of what I'm interested in this expedition in seeing is how these kinds of collaborations will actually function, because it clearly means something to the documentary to have me there to talk about Arctic history. But what will my presence mean as a humanist for these graduate and undergraduate students doing the science?
They will be on social media.
Well, this is the question. We will have very little access to to connectivity. But one of the questions the expedition keeps asking, they want to do live streams with partner institutions. And so whether the emphasis will be on those kinds of exchanges versus students' Instagram posts, what are they going to put up about this? So that's all very interesting to me. Okay, so in thinking about those kinds of communication, so part of what I'm thinking about for this project, one is how those institutional collaborations function on this expedition, should it happen, and should we survive it? Because it's still dangerous. But part of it will, and another aspect will be thinking about the institutional collaborations of places like the Seed Box, environmental humanities collaboratories, environmental humanists and scientists in conversation with each other, thinking about how those function as infrastructures, as academic silos and units, where the urgency those questions comes from, where funding comes from. I'm interested in that too. But then the other part is thinking about how indigenous knowledge and indigenous northern peoples and the rhetoric and conversation around their relationship to climate change is happening, and thinking about indigenous timescales within this project. And my interest in that is less as a way to gesture towards some kind of more direct or immediate or place-based relationship that indigenous northern people have with climate or with ice, although that's a bit part of it, but more about the presentation and the rhetoric of these kinds of conversations. So, and one of the things that I've been thinking through is the way that Native Americans in particular have been treated throughout the 19th and 20th century in the US has been through a rhetoric of vanishing, which has been a way to present Indians as already destined for extinction, as that this is something that is a natural and inevitable human process, and that their disappearance and their removal is to make way for white civilizations in their place. And that logic of vanishing is used to disguise the direct genocide that white Westerners produced on Native populations. But that rhetoric has been really persuasive and really pervasive. It continues in many ways to this day. And one of the things that I've been realizing in reading about climate change and reading about how the news stories about how the Greenlandic Inuit are adapting or not adapting and moving villages, how the Inuit in Canada and in Alaska, again, there's the infrastructural moving of villages because of climate change. There's the lamentation of the absence of being able to maintain traditional hunting ways because there's a reduction in polar bear extensiveness. Fish stock has decreased. And in those stories, it seems to me that because of a long-term, and again, I'm not sure, and I'm curious to know how this works in Scandinavia, because of a long-term sense that Native people, that indigenous people are out of time, that are either extinct already or not part of futurity, or not part of the present, that something about the climate stories that focus on northern indigenous people don't have the same urgency that other climate stories have seemed to have. So thinking through the accelerated effects, because climate change is registering, as I'm sure everybody here knows, in the Arctic in radically accelerated ways than it does in more temperate climates. Something about how that affects northern people seems to fit within a longer, at least again in the US, seems to fit within a longer narrative of vanishing and the idea of indigenous people as not being part of futurity and being already out of time. So I've been looking through, now I'm going to pass around a couple copies here, a memoir called I, Nuligak that is considered to be the first Inuit autobiography. And it's a fascinating document in multiple ways, and in part because it was translated from Inuktitut syllabics in the 1950s and 1960s by a French missionary named Maurice Metayer, who knew Inuktitut, the Inuit language, and who translated those, excuse me, the Inuktitut first into French, and then it was later translated into English. And this was published in 1966. And as you can see from the pocket book, the cheap edition, so the hardback is the first edition, and that pocket book came out a few years later in which it circulated. And as you can see on the front, the little descriptor says, a Canadian Eskimo records the anguish and contentment? And contentment of his primitive life. These are not words, right? These are not the words that would appear on a volume like this today, but it gives you a sense of how even within the terms of this missionary who lived among the Inuit for decades and who, by all accounts, had absorbed the language, had recorded multiple and produced and published compendia of Inuit tales and stories and various literary forms of expression. It's hard to escape that kind of framing. And so Nuligak lived in the Mackenzie River Delta, which is basically on the border of the Yukon in Canada and Alaska. You can see a little relative to the Scandinavian perspective here. So this is the island that you see just off of the national park. Herschel Island is where his family was largely located, and that whole river delta as well. But I'll finish up in a moment here. What the translator, Metayer, is saying at the introduction to this volume is provocative, to say the least. And so Metayer writes, "The original text had many useless repetitions. I have omitted them. I have deleted also reports on fishing and hunting expeditions related the same way year after year and without special adventures to recommend them." And this is someone who's a very sympathetic figure. This is not, Metayer's writing is widely recognized even among Inuit today as important and necessary and useful. And he also goes on to say, "I have translated idea for idea, faithful to tone and color, but I have not always translated word for word. The original Eskimo manuscript is good, even excellent, but a word-for-word translation would often have been meaningless," which would be the case in translating from any language to one another, right? Not just if you do a word-for-word translation, languages don't function in the same way. So that phrase is slightly odd. And he goes on to say that the original manuscript is somewhat like a mate's log, like a ship log, which is very terse and very brief, right? Where seasons and even years are not mentioned, while the most especially interesting facts of an eventful life are related. I've divided the work into chapters and given subtitles, keeping in mind the theme in question as well as the period of Nuligak's life. So some of the things that are interesting to me about this too is the idea of repetition as being useless. That what is privileged and what is valuable here is the original, the new, the singular. And that, as we can, this is where that relation to thinking about both academic institutions and about global and national responses to climate change come in. Useless repetition versus the original and the new. At another point, and this is a story in which Nuligak constantly calls himself the poor orphan boy, and yet Metayer says in another part of the introduction that he's very self-aggrandizing, but I suppose whenever one tells one's own story, we always elevate and exaggerate our abilities. So this is my interest here is not just to attack Metayer, although he deserves it in many ways, but to think about what, in the sense of an autobiography, which is a term that is reserved for the kind of the great man model of history. We think of formerly enslaved people as writing narratives, not autobiographies, right? Frederick Douglass insisted later in life that his own autobiography be called an autobiography and not a narrative because of what it says about the singularity of a life. And Nuligak's point is not about the singularity of a life. It's about representing massive cultural changes. And those massive cultural changes come back to resource extraction. In that Herschel Island area that I just showed you, in this Mackenzie River Delta, starting in the mid to late 19th century, became a whaling ground. And the US whaling fleet and the British whaling fleet ended up there. And so within one generation, the Inuit of this area had been utterly transformed by their contact with the white whaling community. And whaling is based on use of oil. Whaling is about oil and about other industrial products. And within the next generation, the area is transformed through petroleum extraction as well. And so the time scale of Nuligak's own life goes from a childhood in which he'd never seen or heard of a white man to a death by tuberculosis in a Canadian city sanatorium, in which his family is no longer engaged in any of his traditional hunting, in which the total transformation of Inuit lifeways in Canada has been affected. Even as, and so thinking about that kind of telescoping time is a big part of that. And I think, and so the last thing I just will show you, you probably have seen the news from a couple days ago of the Arctic Council meeting in Finland that's happening right now, in which the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo celebrated climate change because it opens new routes for shipping. So the US refused to allow any mention of climate change in the Arctic Accord. And he said, this is America's moment to stand up as an Arctic nation. And then also said that, where's the, this is the part. The Americans were objecting to mention of climate change, or of the Paris Accords, which Pompeo said was literally flowery talk, which is in that second paragraph here. And then he talked about global warming as an opportunity and as a way to have access to a land of opportunity and abundance. Melting sea ice is opening up new shipping routes. We're entering a new age of strategic engagement in the Arctic, complete with new threats to Arctic interests and its real estate. And so, and this was a day after the UN report that said that 1 million species are on the verge of extinction, right? And so thinking of the timescales of opportunity that are used here, which again are easy to criticize and easy to find horrifying, and we can only laugh at them because they are so outrageous, but to think of the telescoping timescales of how these questions are working.
It's also, the discourse of a civilizational project, so he still belongs to that old notion.
Exactly.
They just haven't left that way of thinking.
Exactly, and calling it real estate in those terms. This goes back to the Locke notion of property that Europeans used to justify exterminating Native Americans. They were not developing the land, creating real estate out of land, and therefore didn't deserve it. So those are the questions that I'm starting to think about in this new project, and I welcome your thoughts and questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.